Great. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, and welcome. I'm pleased to see so many people joining us today from the philanthropic and nonprofit sector. I'm Evelyn Stark. I lead MetLife Foundation's financial health work, and today I'm pleased to be moderating today's Ask the Author webinar. As many of you are, MetLife Foundation is a member and national supporter of the Asset Funders Network. And we also supported the research that Gallup, that Priscilla will be sharing with us today. We worked with Gallup to look at financial health on a global basis through a somewhat different lens. We wanted to know how people perceive their own ability to control, their sense of control over their financial situation. Asset Funder Network Ask the Author webinar series is normally a funders-only quarterly series that features short briefings from thought leaders exploring new research. The aim here is to make the insights accessible and actionable, and at 30 minutes, nice and brief. For this particular topic, we thought it would be interesting to a wider audience, and so we opened it up, and I see that we do have quite a few folks from nonprofits, financial services, as well as funders on today's webinar. We are recording today's presentation, and you will receive a link to the recording and the slides by Monday. If you experience any technical difficulties during the presentation, please let AFN staff know by using the question box, which you can see on the control panel on the right side of your screen. You can also use that question box to submit questions to our speakers that Priscilla will answer during Q&A, and share your thoughts on the topic during today's presentation, please. You'll also notice that there is a deck on the right-hand side in PDF. If that is useful to you, you can download today's deck as well. So I have a few introductions to make. I think you all know that the Asset Funders Network is a membership organization of national, regional, and community-based foundation and grant makers who are strategic about using philanthropy to advance economic opportunity and prosperity for LMI folks here in the U.S. And now I am very happy to introduce Priscilla Standridge, who is a Ph.D. and research consultant at Gallup. I think all of you know Gallup. It's a renowned company that delivers analytics and advice to help leaders and organizations solve their most pressing problems. Priscilla is a research and analysis specialist who works on international projects with a wide range of stakeholders. On top of that, Priscilla has the ability to talk about the research in terms that lay people like me understand and appreciate, and I think you will too. So our agenda for the next 20 minutes or so is, as I turn it over to Priscilla, Priscilla will talk for 16 or 17 minutes, and then we'll open it up to take questions for 9 or 10 minutes, and I will have us all wrapped up by 1 p.m. Eastern. And please remember to post your questions over there on the right side of your screen as they arise, and we'll work on sharing them with Priscilla and getting answers. So without any further ado, it is my pleasure to turn this over to Priscilla. Thanks, Priscilla.
Thank you, Evelyn. That was a really great introduction. I'm so pleased to speak with you today, and I'm really excited to share the results of this research. This was really a collaborative effort with the MetLife Foundation and also Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors over the course of the last year. We set out to do this 10-country survey that really spoke to how people perceive their finances, and we thought that that was an important step. So moving on to the next slide, I think that it's really helpful to frame this within Gallup's existing research. We obviously have a big role in the global financial database, the global FinDex for the World Bank. It's an amazing effort that I know many people rely on around the world. It's really opened, I think, conversations that weren't possible before about financial access and inclusion. And with the most recent release, we're really seeing how different efforts around the world are showing up in the trended data sets, and we're really happy to be a part of that. And then in addition, we also work on other projects that have to do with people's financial lives. For example, the PRINDEX is an analysis that we've been doing for several years now, developing a survey on property rights. And the important thing about the PRINDEX is that it merges around people's situations around their property ownership and the different types of ownership that they have and the documentation they have to support it with their perceptions. And that really shows us incredible insights around a lot of things that wouldn't show up ordinarily in data with just about people's access and inclusion around property rights. And so adding in perception gives us a whole new layer of depth and understanding about the way people live their lives in relation to their property. So I think that this project really did a similar step in that direction around adding to the conversation on access and inclusion to talk about people's perceptions. So our project goals here were really to build on what is already out there. So next slide, please. Looking at sort of the landscape of research that's out there, we know that there are really great and impactful measures of inclusion and financial literacy, but we really wanted to add something useful to that conversation around perceptions. And we called this measure that we created financial control. We thought that control was an important aspect to build on those other measures in terms of the extent to which people perceive they are in control and they can influence their financial situation. And we really wanted to see how this related to these other measures that people are already using to track progress in this regard. So how did we measure financial control? In the next slide, you'll see that obviously we wanted to figure out from the literature how people have talked about control from a psychological standpoint. What goes into control? In the next slide, sorry, if we can move forward, you'll see that we had four main concepts based on the literature. We talked about locus of control, which is people's belief that they themselves can impact their lives as opposed to being influenced by external forces. Resilience was an important concept for us to leverage around people's ability to withstand shocks and overcome them. Autonomy, the ability to actually make decisions for oneself and be satisfied with that situation. And then, of course, self-efficacy, which is the ability to set goals and actually achieve them and believe that you're going to be able to achieve those goals. So we started from a much larger set of questions. And we at Gallup, our goal is always to find questions that speak to people in the same ways around the world. And this is a really involved process. We spent over 100 hours just spending time with people in our 10 countries, interviewing them and talking to them about what these questions meant to them. And we really took a lot of that feedback to then change the questions. And you'll see that if you go on our website, you can actually see the full list of questions and how they were asked and actually download all of the data that we collected. And you'll see that the questions are extremely simple. They were, of course, translated into local languages, and we had to find ways to convey these concepts in ways that people around the world in very different economies could understand. So, for example, if you look at question 1, we asked people if they believe that they can change their financial situation. This is obviously a big part of feeling in control, is believing that if something happens, you're going to be able to change the course of that situation. In addition, we wanted to include sort of the more informal ways that people can control their finances. We didn't want to just ask people about the formal networks that they may be a part of. We know that situations around the world can be very different with different financial instruments and different financial systems in place. So we wanted to ask people, without asking them about specific instruments that they may be using, about how they're saving money and if they think that they're doing it enough, how their debt is being managed, and if they feel that they're never going to be able to repay that debt, if they enjoy planning how to spend their money, or if they avoid thinking about it. And a really big important part of that was if people believe that they have people who can help them financially, which is question 10 on this slide. Talking about the way people approach money in a lot of developing economies, we know that people really rely on informal networks and informal sharing of finances and pitching in to help someone and a neighbor and a family member. So we really wanted to include that because we knew that when we asked people about the way they're managing their finances, they're probably thinking about all the different ways that they can figure out how to solve a financial problem. And so the ways that people solve financial problems may not involve the financial system. So moving on to the next slide, we also wanted to benchmark financial control against something a bit more tangible. This, of course, is all self-reported data, so we wanted to ask people, we needed to find a way to ask people about what their objective situation really was. And we wanted to create a metric that was something a bit more traditional, perhaps, something that's more the way we think about how people are in a good financial standing. So we asked a lot of questions in our survey, and once again, I really invite you to go to our website and take a look at the full set of questions, but we really picked 2 questions in particular to benchmark people's objective financial situation, which we call here financial security. So in our survey, we considered people to be financially secure if they had 2 basic aspects of their financial life in a certain situation. So first of all, we wanted them to have 6 months or more of savings. This, of course, according to the literature, and it's debatable, but this was how we chose to benchmark this. We wanted to set a really high bar. 6 months is usually the term by which people will, if they become employed, if something happens, we usually assume that 6 months is the amount of time that they would need to get back on their feet. So we wanted people to say that they had 6 months of savings, but they also needed to say that if they did have a debt, it wasn't making it difficult for them to pay for other things that they might need. So if you look at the way the questions are worded, you'll see that, for example, the savings includes assets. It's not just the monetary bank account that you might have, an investment fund, a mutual fund. It includes things that you might be able to sell if you needed to. So we really wanted to cover as many situations around the world as possible. And then on the debt side, we had to convey that in a way that people were really going to understand. We asked people if they had a debt towards a person, towards a financial institution, and then if they did indicate that they had debt, we asked them what position it put them in terms of having to pay for the other things that they needed in their lives. So we didn't set an exact amount of debt or any type of monetary value to that. We wanted to align it with their needs. So if you look at the question, it says that they have a debt, but it does not make it difficult for them to pay for the other things they need. And we considered these people to be financially secure. Now, on the flip side of that, we wanted to create a category of people that were in a very difficult financial situation to understand how they felt about their finances. So this category, we included people that either had less than 1 month of savings, or they said that it was very difficult for them to make payments to repay a debt that they had. So you can imagine that people that are in this situation, whether it's because of having very little savings or because they have a very large debt that makes it very difficult for them to pay for other things, if they lost their income, if anything were to happen to them or their families, they would very rapidly fall into a situation of not being able to pay and cover their needs financially. So these were the broad categories that we created on those 2 ends of the spectrum. And people in the middle, we considered them to be stretched because we imagined a situation in which either you don't have a lot of savings, or maybe you do have savings, but you do have a lot of debt. Either way, these people were not necessarily faring excellently, but we did think that they were sort of a middle category. So we, of course, wanted to understand, how does perception of financial control, as measured by those 10 questions I showed you earlier that speak to people's ability to overcome situations that might arise and leverage those informal networks or formal networks that they might have at their disposal, how does that compare then to people's situation? So their security, their debt, and their savings that they have available. So moving on to the next slide, we of course looked at those 2 things together. If you look at the bars, you'll see that the green portion of the bar is people who are financially secure based on our definition. And it's across the 10 countries that were included in this study. Those countries were Kenya, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Colombia, Chile, Greece, South Korea, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And these are hand-picked countries. We thought that they were interesting for a variety of reasons, based on their GDP, based on their level of financial inclusion, based on their recent sociopolitical situation. For example, Greece obviously was a very fascinating test case study for all the things that have been going on there from an economic standpoint. But we also wanted to use the US sort of as our benchmark, because we know that in the US we do have more research and we can compare it to what's already out there. So looking at the number of people who are secure, insecure, and stretched in the US, we actually see that this aligns very closely with the findings of the CFPB research. In the CFPB research, they found that 34% of Americans were struggling to make ends meet. So they also saw that there was a third of people who were in various situations in terms of being part of a high bar, a very low bar, and then a middle situation that's neither good nor bad necessarily. So we were comforted by this because we managed to sort of group people based on two very basic questions and then set those standards comparably around the world. And so when we look at the US, we see that 33% of Americans count themselves as secure based on their self-reported data. But when we look at the number of people who feel that they are financially in control based on those 10 questions, we see that 54% of Americans say that they're financially in control. And this is an interesting gap that we see. What we're seeing here is that perception probably accounts for those factors that aren't necessarily formal financial instruments and resources that people have. People are thinking about the people in their lives that could help them come into solve a situation. They're thinking about the ways that they could overcome problems, and fundamentally their confidence in their ability to overcome their problems and find a way to control their finances if something were to happen. So that's an interesting juxtaposition when we look at the US. And then we look at other countries, we see that sometimes people's perception of their financial control is a lot lower than the percentage of people who are financially secure. If we look at Japan and South Korea, we see that relationship become a little bit in the opposite direction. People seem to be lacking a lot of confidence in their ability to control their finances and overcome those situations. But then we see countries, for example, Bangladesh and Chile, where relatively the number of people who are financially secure based on our definition of that is very, very small, yet people seem to have a sense that they are financially in control of their situation. So moving on to the next slide, we also wanted to create a model of what it looks like for people to be financially insecure. We modeled this based on the category of people who are insecure because, as you saw, in a lot of those countries, the number of people who were financially secure was actually quite small, so it made it difficult to create some valid analysis that was going to have significant results. So we modeled financial insecurity, and to do that, we used a logistic regression that included a lot of different factors, and we wanted to isolate what the most important factors are in predicting insecurity. And so we controlled for income. Income obviously is very closely related to insecurity in many situations. We wanted to find factors that weren't simply suggesting we need to give people more money. We wanted to isolate what other factors came into play. So we included a lot of different factors: demographic factors, geographic factors, factors around people's use and history using financial services and their perceptions of the financial system. And what we saw was really interesting in that in 9 out of 10 countries, lower perceived financial control was the #1 predictor of financial insecurity. This means that those factors of people's reporting of how they perceive their control of their finances are actually extremely related to financial insecurity. And secondly, in 8 out of 10 cases, we see that having less education is extremely closely related as well. And this really shouldn't surprise a lot of practitioners that work in this space. Education broadly, not just financial literacy and math, but also sort of understanding reading comprehension and critical thinking, and obviously the way education sets people up for life later on in terms of employment and status in the world, those are actually huge factors in this, and that should be something that we should really pay attention to. And then of course we see a variety of demographic factors come into play: age, gender, marriage, those types of things. Interestingly, in Kenya, the #1 predictor of financial insecurity was region. And we know that in Kenya, there are a lot of areas that are primarily agricultural, and they probably have very inconsistent flows of income in those regions. So moving on to the next slide, another very important factor that we wanted to look at was, of course, account ownership. And so we took the data from the most recent Findex, and we wanted to see the relationship between account ownership and security, and then of course perception of control. And so interestingly here, of course, and also not surprisingly, I think a lot of you were probably very familiar with Findex data. We do see countries where account ownership is approaching 100%. So from South Korea, Japan, the UK, and the US, we do see that in these countries, which also have higher GDP, have higher levels of economic development, account ownership is approaching 100%. But what we see in the US, for example, is that when we measure something like security that also includes debt, we're seeing a number of people that actually are more financially insecure than other countries like the UK, where there are more social networks for social support around health and unemployment. So when we look at the things that go into play in terms of people being insecure, account ownership probably isn't the main factor there. And we do see countries at the lower end of the spectrum. For example, Kenya is obviously an interesting case with the recent boom of mobile services and account ownership there. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that that is very closely related with the percentage of people who are financially secure. But more importantly, I think it's important to ask ourselves if account ownership is driving a sense of financial control, which is what we'll see on the next slide. We would hope that having a bank account, having a safe place to put your money and your savings and be able to withdraw funds and manage that flow of money, hopefully through some type of mobile app or something that you can control on a daily basis, would help people feel more financially in control of their situation. And what we see is that there are certain countries where there is higher account ownership, but that hasn't necessarily brought to higher levels of financial control that we would hope to see. There is a gap there. And I think that that gap is really what I think a lot of people are talking about, also based on the recent Findex results around usage. We really wonder when we look at the number of bank accounts in a country, okay, are people using these accounts? How are they using them? What type of impact is this usage making on their lives? So I think that that's a really inspiring thing to look at in terms of how can we drive, now that we have account ownership, how can we also drive people's perceived financial control? Because we would hope that having these services in people's lives would also drive the perception that they are going to be financially in control of their futures. So in terms of final thoughts, on the next slide, we really felt that it was really interesting and comforting to see how, first of all, creating these metrics and creating questions and measures that translate around the world was a huge, important finding for us as researchers. We thought it was really important to find ways to ask people about their finances that were not contingent on banking services or specific questions around specific financial instruments. So we were really comforted by that. And then, of course, we saw that lower levels of perceived control over one's finances are huge predictors of financial insecurity. This means that financial control isn't something that is completely determined by one's just personal optimism or anything like that. This is something that people really feel in their daily lives. And then, of course, perceptions of financial control are not necessarily related to having a bank account. And I think that this is sobering, but it really pushes the conversation that also Findex is driving around, okay, how do we build financial services that really do make an impact on people's perceptions and ultimately their well-being? And I think it's also very exciting to see that, now that we have these measures, we want to understand how we can move the needle on all of these factors, all of these parameters. The next step would be to have a global data set so that we can look at things across different regions and we can look at things over time to see how does different policy changes, how do different programs, how do different factors influence the variations of these variables in people's lives. So I think that thinking to next steps, which of course we'll probably discuss more in the next Q&A, we really feel...
Priscilla, this is Christy from Asset Funders Network. If you can do this in 30 seconds so that we can open up for dialogue, that would be great.
Yeah, I think that it's just really starting to think about how we can continue to measure financial well-being, financial health, beyond the many ways that we've discovered already. I think that we have a lot of really great tools and we can start thinking about new concepts, new measures to continue to add to that conversation. So I welcome some questions now.
Okay, great, perfect. So Julie, if you could advance this to the question slide, I want to remind folks that you can submit your questions over on the control panel. I will moderate. I'm the Financial Capability Program Officer for the Asset Funders Network. And we do have a question from the audience, and the question more or less is, given the way that some major financial institutions have used unscrupulous or predatory practices, how can having an account increase people's confidence in their financial security? What's your perspective on that?
I think that's definitely the question that we need to ask ourselves. I think a lot of people have been investing a lot of time and research into creating financial services, be it accounts or savings programs, or just the information that's available to people when they open an account, to really drive that and think about the consumer. So I think that we definitely started from that standpoint of thinking about, okay, what does the consumer see when they go into their financial lives? So I think this is definitely a conversation that should become part of those services.
Got you. So much more consumer-centric, consumer-friendly.
Absolutely.
So the next one is, what do we know about perceptions of financial control related to actual control based on the policies that are in a particular country? Did that come up at all in your research?
So definitely, I mean, we know something about these countries, but that's definitely a next step. I mean, ideally, we would want to merge these questions with the data collection that's happening also on Findex. So I showed here just simple account ownership. It would be great to continue to analyze within these countries and even more countries to understand how different policies and different availability of services has impacted these perceptions for people. Those are great next research questions. And again, the data is available online. I invite everyone to go and download it immediately. We were able to sort of, I think, scratch the surface on the incredible data set that we've collected. This data set includes, like I mentioned, a lot of information about the demographic aspects of people, household composition, a lot of information about their perceptions of the financial system, their perceptions and history using financial services, and then, of course, a lot of really valuable information about their debt and savings, and then, of course, their perception of their financial control over those situations.
Great. Thank you. Someone wanted you to go back and answer how you came up with the predictors of insecurity across the different countries.
Sure. I don't know if you want to pull up that slide. Yeah. So we ran a logistic regression, and we included the factors that basically, based on the literature, people hypothesize being drivers of financial insecurity. So we really included everything from demographic factors to savings and all of those other things. We also included, we had a financial literacy question in our survey. We were only able to include one because those can become very taxing for people. So we included financial literacy, we included education more broadly, we included previous experience of having used financial services and mobile services. So we included really a wide range of variables, and the logistic regression revealed the top 5 for each country that were significant. And so those are what are being shown here. And I would invite people to, run their own models. There's, we included a certain set of variables that we felt were important. That information is also available online. But I would really invite people, if they have other research questions that they want to understand sort of how different factors were influencing each other. That was also one of the goals of this data set. We wanted to provide people with an extremely comprehensive data set so we can begin to explore those relationships a bit more.
Great, thank you. Well, given where we are with time, I think we're going to close the question and answer portion. There are a couple of questions that are still in the box, and we will follow up with folks after. As Julie said, as Evelyn said, we normally send out a link to the presentation Monday following one of these webinars. So those answers will be included then. And I want to turn it over to Evelyn to just wrap us up and close us out so we end on time.
Great, thanks, Christy, and big thanks to Priscilla and Gallup for the work and for sharing your information and knowledge with us today. I think this is really important. Financial health is a goal of all of us who are in this space. We've been getting better at understanding it. We've been getting better at measuring it. And now we really want to get better at moving the needle. this dimension of financial control really gives us a more holistic picture and allows us to be more thoughtful, as everybody on this call is. I'm sorry we didn't get to everybody's questions. Priscilla has given us her contact information, and so we will share those as well. And if Priscilla didn't make it clear enough, the data is available. So please, go to it and see what you find that might be useful for your program. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, AFN, for hosting this once again. Super interesting event. Thank you.
Thank you.